Hi everybody. Today what I'd like to do is to just put a little video together for people who are either doing the AS Macroeconomics unit for the first time or for Year 13 Upper 6 students who are resitting this macro unit. I want to have a look at previous papers and consider topics which might be worth revising a little bit more in depth than some of the other topics, given what has been on the previous few exam papers. So in order to do this, what you need to do is you need a copy of your specification, which I have on the screen at the moment. So we're looking at page 12, is the start of the National and International Economy unit. You also need a copy of the 3 previous question papers. The general rule is that the exam board will not set similar questions to what has been on the 3 previous sessions. So for the 3 previous sessions, we should be looking at January 2013, then we have the summer 2013 papers, that's May 2013, and we have the summer 2014 paper. You can get those from the OCR website. They're freely available to download and the mark schemes are there for you as well. So whenever you have got access to those, what you need to do is you simply need to go through each one and to highlight the various topic areas which are appearing on each question paper. And I have done that on this spreadsheet, which I shall now put in front of you. Let me just check this is in focus. And let me just zoom in on what we've got here. So you should be able to see in front of you we've got the January 2013 paper and the May 2013 paper, just a little summary of what's on each. So on the January 2013 paper, it started off with a question, very badly done question actually, I remember marking these at the time. What is the only thing that can cause a movement along the aggregate demand curve? The answer to that, as I'm sure you know, is a change in the price level. However, lots of people wrote things like income, population, things which would cause the AD curve to shift rather than for there to be a movement along. So that's a NB, nota bene, just to take care of a question like that. There was then a set of questions on net exports, X minus M, and the trade balance, whether or not exports minus imports was in surplus or deficit. Do take care on questions like that you refer to the trade balance rather than the budget balance. The budget balance, of course, being government spending and taxation. There was a follow-up question about the current account position to identify some components of the current account, 2 components I think it was. Trade in goods, trade in services, current transfers, property income from abroad, those being the 4 components. There was a demand and supply question on exchange rates. There was a question asking you to identify different causes of unemployment. So you should be familiar with the frictional, casual, seasonal, structural, cyclical, regional causes. There was a further question about unemployment and growth, whether both can be achieved at the same time, or not really whether both can be achieved. Is it desirable, obviously, to have growth, and what will the impact be on unemployment, I think was the question. There was a question on inflation. There was a question on, I think it was something to do with whether or not income taxes fell, what would the impact be on inflation. And then the big heavyweight question, the 18-mark question, was an aggregate supply, a supply side policies question. So that was January 2013. In the summer of 2013, started off with some questions on the circular flow of income. So identifying the key injections and withdrawals, I, G and X being your key injections, S, T and N being your key withdrawals. Further question asking you some factors which determine consumption levels. A further inflation question, I believe, I'll have to check, but I think the data question itself did carry a chart on inflation and it simply asked you to describe that chart. Just worth noting at this stage, when you're asked to describe inflation data, if the data shows inflation falls, say from a rate of 5% to 4%, do not, in your answer, suggest that prices are falling, because of course they're not. As long as inflation is positive and above zero, then price levels will always be rising. So price levels will be rising, but at a slower rate if the inflation rate falls from 5% to 4%. Obviously that's not a big problem in the UK economy at the moment, given our CPI rate of 0.3% actually close to deflation. Next set of questions was on interest rates and investments. What was the relationship between the two? There was something on supply side policies and how they would stimulate growth, and then something on the macroeconomic objectives. Remember, the macroeconomic objectives are economic growth, low unemployment, low and stable inflation, a favourable trade balance. And then finally, the discussion question, the 18 marker, was on exchange rates and inflation. Quite a nice question, but quite a tricky question as well. And then moving on, in the summer of 2014, so this is the most recent paper, let me just check that you can actually see that on screen. So in the summer of 2014, the key things that were tested were different components of AD, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. You were asked to define what macroeconomic equilibrium is, which strangely people found difficult, but obviously that's simply the point at which AD equals IS. There were some monetary policy questions. Again, something on inflation, but this time more related to inflation and how that relates to unemployment. Obviously there's a trade-off there, as I'm sure you know, on the Phillips curve of your KAS curve, your Keynesian aggregate supply curve, and the trade-off being that as you reduce the level of unemployment, you have to accept higher and higher inflation rates. There was a further set of questions on economic growth, consumption. For the first time that I can remember, there was a question on the multiplier. Now, it was more or less to simply define the multiplier, and if you wanted to get the full marks on the question, there was a calculation to be done. Now, this was very badly done. I marked these, about 500 of them, and this is very badly done, so I wouldn't be surprised if this is assessed again in the future. Maybe not this session, but certainly sessions to come. Again, the current account was tested, and the actual essay was on the current account as well. Quite a difficult, quite a tricky one, and it was talking about the current account moving from deficit to surplus, moving from a position where the value of imports greater than the value of exports, moving from that position to a position where the value of exports are greater than the value of imports. Sadly, and unfortunately, some people discussed the budget balance, taxation and government spending, and so out of 18 were awarded 0 marks, so that's something you've got to be very careful of. So now, having looked at all of that, what you can do is you can go back to your specification, look at what has been assessed in the previous 3 sessions, and now look to see what might be, and this is by no means foolproof, but you can look and see what might be tested in the May 2015 paper. So I've had a go at this, and here's my thoughts for what they're worth on it. Let me just once again double check that you can see that. Okay, so let's take each of these in turn. The paper gets more difficult progressively, and therefore the questions at the start of the paper are generally quite straightforward and easy, generally about the components and determinants of AD. So things which haven't been asked in the last 3 sessions anyway are to consider the determinants of government spending, and perhaps consider the determinants of exports minus imports, your net exports component. Movements along the AD curve, as I said, were tested in January of 2013, but there hasn't been anything recently on shifts of the AD curve, so maybe that's something worth considering. And I think it's also worth having a look again at the multiplier, because it really was very badly done by candidates last year, so maybe this year or in the sessions to come it'll be tested again. Things which you're asked to define, these really should be gimme marks, and you really just need to learn them word for word and regurgitate them where appropriate. So things like defining economic growth, defining the balance of payments, that's an interesting one because it's asking you to define balance of payments rather than the current account. Define income redistribution. Now, income redistribution, as far as I can remember on this specification, has never been really assessed, so that's certainly something worth considering. And define the term economic stability. Now, interestingly, you won't actually find that definition in the AS textbook. You need to look to the A2 one for that, but it is on the AS specification. Next, you might be asked, and this is just getting more and more common, that you're given a set of data, and generally speaking that is a graph. Now, in the previous sessions it's been unemployment and inflation, so maybe in this session you will be presented with a data set and a chart on economic growth, and you'll be asked to describe and discuss it. I could very well see a chart on economic growth where we've got the quarters of growth, positive and negative, and you might be asked to describe that data, and obviously you'd be looking to say things along the lines of, well, if the percentage growth rate falls from 2% to 1%, growth rates have fallen, but actual growth continues to rise. You'd only be discussing falls in economic growth and contractions in GDP if those percentage changes were negative. Something to look out for. In terms of definitions again, defining GDP and defining real GDP, this hasn't been on the paper for a long time. Something worth considering. I remember, it must be quite a few sessions ago now, it's maybe 2011, 2010, you were asked to explain how inflation was measured. That was a 5-mark question. So you could well get that type of question again, but maybe related to economic growth, how is it measured, or maybe related to unemployment, how rates of unemployment are actually calculated. And then obviously there are difficulties associated with measuring each of those, and it would be worth having a good working knowledge of those. The structure of the current account, that has been asked in recent sessions, but it's been quite badly answered, I think, so that might be something to consider again. Now let me just see if I can straighten this up a bit and zoom in on it for you. Whoops. Okay, so I hope that's a little bit clearer and you can actually see that. I'll try and make sure that you can actually read what's on this particular sheet. So moving on, define fiscal policy. Now this is a really interesting one because fiscal policy has not been asked for quite a few sessions, and we've had monetary policy lately, we've had supply side policies, but nothing really on fiscal policy, government spending, taxation, national debt, fiscal austerity, budget surplus, budget deficit, balanced budget. All of these terms could be key issues on this paper, and certainly something I'm going to look at quite closely with my students. The UK's pattern of international trade, you just really need to have an awareness of that really. If you Google it, you'll be able to pick up lots of data on that. But I think if you do Google it, the basic information is that sort of our exports and imports, the top 8 for both, generally speaking, come from mainland Europe. We don't have many trade links at all with the emerging market economies, the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, the MIS nations, Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, Turkey, etc. We really don't have that greater trade link with those, and those are areas obviously that the current government are trying to break new ground with. International trade, just the concept of free trade, removing barriers to trade, tariffs and quotas and voluntary export constraints. Again, that's never been assessed really in recent times, and so that's certainly something worth considering. And so then we get to the final, the big 18 mark question, what might be asked for an 18 marker. This course has been going since 2009, January 2009, and so all of the easy essay questions have been asked already. So things that you want to be maybe focusing your revision on, but not exclusively to the detriment of everything else, because as I say, this is no foolproof guarantee of what's going to be on the paper. I don't know. I'm just trying to, like you will be, I'm just trying to make an educated guess at it. So maybe to consider the consequences of unemployment, maybe to consider the costs, benefits and sustainability of economic growth. That would actually be quite a nice essay. Fiscal policy, as I've mentioned, has not appeared at all anywhere really on previous papers, apart from a little bit of reference to tax. So you might get a fiscal policy question. Obviously, the coalition governments in the last few years have been embarking upon an austerity fiscal policy, reducing G, primarily, a little bit of T rising, but not much really. It's all come from government spending cuts to the public sector, as us teachers know only too well. So you might get something along those lines. Monetary policy. If you're going to get a monetary policy question, I guess it's going to be on the base rate, and the base rate 0.5% year on year on year. You would of course expect that to stimulate consumption, investment, net exports. In reality that hasn't been the case, and then you'd be expected to explain why. It'd be a nice little essay, that one. And then finally you might get an essay which is asking you to discuss maybe the conflict between, let's say for example, is economic growth, is it desirable given the impact that it might have on the trade balance, or is reducing unemployment always desirable? And you could go into things like, well, on the one hand it is, but of course then it leads to demand pull inflationary pressures, perhaps cost pull, etc., etc. So there are all sorts of potential policy conflict questions that you could be asked. So those are my thoughts anyway on 582. I'll try and do one on F581, the micro unit, but that might be a few weeks down the line. You can do it yourselves in exactly the same way. Get the papers for the last 3 sessions, go through each one, pick out the key topics, then consult your specification and see what was not assessed in those 3 previous sessions, and you should be able to come up with a decent paper yourself. Okay, so see you next time.